All right, so I wanted to do a bit of a off the top of my head video about powerlifting while I do my steps. Now, I actually already recorded this video, but I watched it back and I wasn't happy with it. I got a bit carried away, a bit frustrated because there is a lot of things to talk about when it comes to hypertrophy for powerlifters. And often, powerlifters are missing some very key things within their training. So I'm going to go over a few things that are super important for powerlifters that I see commonly misunderstood, misprogrammed, or whatever, misinterpreted as well. So we're going to start out with volume. So powerlifters often do too much. Now that is not a hot take. We know this. But what's important for powerlifters to understand is that they are already at a disadvantage when it comes to growing muscle because fatigue is the enemy of growing muscle. I'm going to explain how this works. So, your first session in the week after your rest days, it's probably going to be the most effective because there's no fatigue present. So, let's say you rest Saturday, Sunday, and you train Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. That Monday session is going to be the most effective because you had 2 rest days. You had basically no fatigue present. Now, the first workout, the first set of each workout is also the most effective because there is no fatigue present. And the first set of each muscle group is the most effective for that muscle group because there is no fatigue present. So basically, when you're fresh, that is when you can experience the most hypertrophy. This is very, in my opinion, very easy to understand, and it's replicated throughout the literature. And I'm out of breath because I just ate a heap of carbs and I feel like I'm going to be sick. So, powerlifters are often do too much, right? And because they're already doing SBD at the start of their workout, they're immediately fatigued, right? So they go into their first accessory movement. Let's just say it's leg extensions. They already have fatigue from squats. So when you compare someone who's a bodybuilder and a powerlifter, the powerlifter has fatigue present from SBD, the bodybuilder does not. So the bodybuilder is immediately in a better position to grow muscle. And that's totally fine because that's part of the sport. You have to do powerlifting to do powerlifting. You can't not do SBD. You have to, and that's okay because that's the sport. But just know that the more SBD you do and the more fatigue you have, the more you are limiting your ability to grow muscle. Now, we often hear anecdotes within powerlifting that would disprove what I've just said. Oh, I can still grow heaps of muscle off high volume SBD. Like I do a high volume SBD day or whatever, and then I do all my accessories and I grow heaps of muscle. You'll hear things like that. It's physiologically impossible for that to be the most effective way or even a very effective way of doing things. Now, the reason I'm harping on about volume is because if you spend the first 6 sets of your workout doing bench press, there is so much fatigue that you can't then go and grow a lot from your chest press or your dips or your push downs or whatever, because there's muscular fatigue from sets that weren't taken close to failure, so your bench press, and there's also central nervous system fatigue from all the sets that you've done already. So let's say you do 6 sets of bench and then you go do chest pressing. You might gain a tiny bit of muscle, like a tiny bit. But someone who only does 2 or 3 sets of bench and then goes and does their chest press, they might gain twice as much muscle. This is obviously arbitrary because we don't have specific values. I'm just trying to prove a point here. So, if you're unsure that your high volume powerlifting SBD approach, if you're unsure if that's actually beneficial for you, don't do it. Do less. Do less SBD because most people, and I mean 9.5 times out of 10, probably more, you can benefit so much from just growing more muscle than you, like more so than you will from being better at doing SPD, which is the main reason that people do more SPD is to get better at it. Now, people often claim that the volume of power, like the SPD volume is what drives the strength adaptations. But we know that volume, it does not increase strength. Like volume itself is not the mechanism for strength gain. We have neural adaptations. And well, the main two you're going to see are neural adaptations and muscle gain. There's obviously things like your tendons and all that that can adapt and whatever, but that's not important. Not in this context. So if there are two main ways we get stronger in powerlifting, we have neural adaptation, which is practicing your wedge, practicing your slack pull, practicing your knee and hip timing, like just practicing SPD, whatever. And we also have hypertrophy, right? So you should look at volume like this. What is the least amount of SPD I can do to maintain or increase my skill? What is the minimum amount that I can get away with? And then after that, do your hypertrophy. So let's say that you think that you can maintain your skill if you're good at powerlifting, or improve your skill if you're not so good yet, with 3 sets of bench on Monday, for example, and then 2 sets on Thursday. Don't do any more than that. If you think that is the minimum you need, do the minimum, because you're gonna maintain that skill, or you increase that skill slowly week to week, and then all the real gains will come from your bodybuilding work after, where you're actually seeing an increase in muscle fiber size. And I'm telling you, if you're decent at powerlifting, you're going to see so many more gains, or so much more, from focusing on bodybuilding versus focusing on doing a shitload of sets for powerlifting. So when it comes to your SPD volume, take a minimal approach. Now, let's touch on bodybuilding volume. So a lot of powerlifters thrive off anecdotes. So you will hear an anecdote like, high volume squats help me increase my 1RM. That's totally fine. I'm not going to argue with powerlifting anecdotes because they're valid. There isn't much research, so you kind of have to just go off anecdote. But what I can argue with, and I will argue with, is how that does not transfer into bodybuilding. Because SPD going up is not the same as increases in muscle size. We don't have much research on SPD. We have a lot of research on hypertrophy. And when it comes to hypertrophy volume, each set you do is less effective than the last set. And I already explained that at the start of the video, where I said that the first set is the most effective. The second set is effective, but it's less effective. The third set is maybe somewhat effective, but it's much less effective. Each set you do is worse than the last one. So this is why we see powerlifters getting stuck doing high volume, because they will do like 10 plus sets of a certain, of a certain muscle group after their SPD work. So let's say we're doing 10 sets of hamstrings a week and conventional deadlifting and some sort of like, let's say secondary deadlift, like a hinge, like a stiff leg. You're already so fatigued from the deadlifting and the pause deadlifts or the stiff leg deadlifts or whatever, and then you've added like 10 sets of a muscle group or however many sets. That is, one, going to impede your recovery so much that you will not grow much muscle at all. And two, going to impede your recovery so much that it's going to slow down your SPD, because remember, central nervous system fatigue applies to everything you do. So if I go and do a whole bunch of sets of hamstrings, my central nervous system is fatigued. The next day when I bench, My hamstrings are not going to affect my bench press in terms of muscular fatigue because we don't use the hamstrings, but the central nervous system is fatigued. So these powerlifters, they they kind of miss how it works, right? Because it's not just local muscular fatigue. It's not just, oh, my biceps are sore, my pecs are sore. Your entire body is tired from high volume, and that is affecting everything. And that is often replicated, or sorry, evident in how good people feel during their peaks. Now, I understand the point of a peak and a taper is to make the athlete feel better for competition, and that is the way it should be done. But if you are going from, let's say, 10 to 15 sets of a muscle group in your prep, and you go down to 4 to 10 sets or 4 to 8, for example, in your peak, and performance increases and you get stronger and you feel better, that should tell you that your peak is written well, so great. But also it tells you that you are doing way too much, way too much. So if you're someone who feels quite bad in training, quite bad in their prep, but feels amazing during their peak and amazing on meet day, that might be a sign that you are doing way too much in your training. So in bodybuilding, if we reduce volume and progressive overload picks up, it means we weren't recovering. And you can apply that same logic to powerlifting. Now, it's a little different in powerlifting because you're always going to have fatigue from SBD, and that is okay. But if you reduce your accessory volume and you see an increase in progressive overload, you were doing too much. You were not recovering. It takes about 24 hours to recover from one set and 48 to recover from two. And if you're doing more than that, it just increases exponentially every set. So there are multiple studies done where you'll do, I think they do about 6 to 8 sets, and they're not recovered after 6 days. 6 days. Now this whole volume conversation so far, we haven't touched on frequency. So high volume on one day is bad. So let's say you do Monday. You do all your leg accessories on Monday. High volume. You are only getting one first set for the quads, one first set for the hamstrings, one for the glutes, one for the calves, whatever. So those are the effective ones. And every set you do after that, it might give you a little bit of progress, but not really. If you were to just do lower volume and split it up over 2 days, you would get 2 first sets. Now we can theorize or hypothesize that 2 first sets using a 2 times frequency is significantly more effective than 1 first set. I would go as far as to say it's twice as effective. And we're seeing all the frequency data come out and show us that a 1 times frequency sucks. So if you're powerlifting and you're using a high volume 1 times frequency approach, you will benefit significantly from bringing it down, halving your volume or more, and doing it 2 times frequency. So if you're using high volume, if you're using a 1 times frequency, the easiest and most effective change you can make in your training is to go to a 2 times frequency and use lower volume. That is not just my opinion, that is very clear in the evidence. So, should you ever use a 3 times frequency in powerlifting? Because I'm sure that's a question that someone might have. And my answer would be no. So I'm going to quickly touch on how this works. So when you train, you trigger protein synthesis, and it lasts about 48 hours. Now, in that process, your body is doing 2 things. It is increasing the size of the fibers because they have experienced the stimulus they need, which is mechanical tension and high threshold motor unit recruitment. The other process is healing muscle damage. Now, muscle damage and fatigue are the enemy of growth. I'll say it again. Fatigue is the opposite of growth. And in that process, some of your physiological resources have to go to healing damage. If you were to train again within that 48 hours, you would create more damage because your body is not in a place to experience more hypertrophy in the same muscle during protein synthesis. And if you create more damage, those physiological processes are stolen away in terms of resources from growth. You steal the growth resources and you put them in the healing damage box. The healing damage box does not make you grow. All it does is help you recover. You want all your resources to be in the growing muscle box of protein synthesis. So that means that you want to keep fatigue and muscle damage as low as possible. That means that soreness is a bad thing. That means that high levels of fatigue are a bad thing. It means drop sets, supersets, high reps, whatever you can think of that isn't a straight set, whatever training mechanism that you can think of that isn't a straight set or antagonistic supersets, so opposing muscle supersets to save time, anything else is probably bad. Time and time again, straight sets, low volumes, slightly higher frequencies show us that they are the superior training method. So back to my original couple of points. You want to use lower volume, lower than someone like myself who is not powerlifting, because you already have fatigue present, and I've just explained how fatigue reduces growth. So if fatigue reduces growth, you don't want to do high volume, and you certainly don't want to use a 1 times frequency, because as I said, a 2 times frequency is probably twice as effective as a 1 times frequency. You can do less volume, you have less atrophy, and you grow more. So for a powerlifter, obviously it depends on the person and a whole lot of things, but I could guarantee you, you do not ever need to do 10 sets of a muscle group, ever, for any reason when you're powerlifting. So you need to be 9 or under. Can also guarantee you that you never, ever need to do 4 sets of any exercise. It is so common to see 4 sets of 12. 4 sets of 12 to 15 in powerlifting. If you have a good split with a 2 times frequency, you never ever need to do 4 sets of anything, because you will have enough exercises to get the sets you need without creating redundancy, without doing high volume, and it's so easy to do that. And if you're watching this and you're thinking, my split wouldn't allow for a 2 times frequency, it's a bad split. That means it's a bad split. So if you look at your program and you go, there's no way that I could fit a 2 times frequency for quads or a 2 times frequency for pecs or any muscle, you need to rework your split. Because most people watching this are going to get most of their gains in powerlifting from extra muscle mass. Unless you are an elite powerlifter, 500 plus dots at your natural ceiling, heaps of muscle, very lean, unless that is you, which is probably not, then you need to focus on growing muscle more than your, deadlift setup or whatever. And I'm not saying don't focus on those things. I'm just saying don't write your entire split around perfecting your wedge, putting all your time and energy into sumo, your sumo variation like pause sumo. And then, the way that you do all your little drills after your sumo to do another thing I'm going to get to and explain myself better is like drills and doing certain accessories to complement the main lifts, like the belt squats, the RP7 belt squats with 50 plates, and the wall supported B stands RDL with a twist. to work on the hinge and all that stuff, and we'll get there. So other than volume and frequency, we've got to touch on what I just mentioned, the exercise selection, but we'll get there. But a really easy one is rep ranges. If you are doing high reps in powerlifting, you are severely holding yourself back because high reps increase fatigue. And as I said, fatigue is the enemy of growth. So you need to stay between the 5 and 10 rep range. I would never go above 10 unless I absolutely had to. Pain, injury, enjoyment for whatever reason, because you max out a machine. There are really only a few reasons you would go above 10. And I'm going to take a wild guess and say that most of you don't ever need to go above 10. So that's an easy one. Tick that off. Throw that in the bin. Rep ranges are sorted. 5 and 10. Stay in that range. We could say 5 and 8, but I understand that sometimes 8, 9, 10, probably the same. So that's your rep ranges sorted. We've done lower volumes. We've done splitting up that volume over 2 days. And we've done rep ranges. So the next thing that I want to touch on is exercise selection, which I just mentioned before. A lot of powerlifters will do their SBD, and then the next exercise is something like hook lying dumbbell bench press. And the reason it's hook lying or, Larson is because it's complementing the bench press where we're learning to use the pecs without using the legs. Those sorts of things where you're doing a hyper-specific drill, like an exercise, but you're kind of doing it as a drill for your main lift, you're probably not getting anything out of that in terms of skill. And all you're doing by doing a Larson dumbbell press instead of just a normal dumbbell press is you're just reducing your ability to recruit the muscle fibers that you want to train to grow muscle. So let's use this hook lying bench press as an example. I have seen a lot of people do hook lying dumbbell press. If you don't know what that means, it's just feet up dumbbell press. Zena. It's just feet up dumbbell press. And all it does is reduce your stability. And when we have reduced stability, we have reduced high threshold motor unit recruitment. And you need high threshold motor unit recruitment to grow maximally. So why would you use your first accessory exercise, the one that's going to be the best for growth? Because as I said, there is minimal fatigue at the start of the session. Why would you hand off all that energy to an unstable movement that's not going to grow much muscle at all, and that hardly, if at all, contributes to your main lift? So you'll see things like RP 6 or 7 belt squat. Why? If you want to do more squat volume, just do more squat volume. Doing RP6, RP7 accessories is going to grow very little muscle, especially the way that powerlifters do them, where it's like hips are shooting back out of the hole, moving super fast, like using the stretch reflex, hardly training to a high intensity at all. You've just done a set that basically grows zero muscle, hardly, if at all, contributes to your main lifts in terms of skill. And I would err on the side of saying they never help your main lifts, almost never, but has created so much fatigue that the rest of your workout is now less effective. So we'll touch on specific exercise selection in a second, but I have a gripe with powerlifters doing these drills as their first accessory movement that they think is contributing to their main lift. It almost never is, but is adding fatigue and is reducing their ability to experience hypertrophy after that. So you've got like your B stance wall supported like hinging drills where again, it's like RP7. Why? For what purpose? Hook lying bench press with a dumbbell. Dumbbell bench press, hook lying. Why not just put your feet down, increase stability, and increase your ability to experience hypertrophy? Why do you have to do it with your legs up? Why do you have to do the PRI, restoration, cable whatevers, instead of just training hard and gaining some muscle? These are trends that I've seen on Instagram over the last few years, and they're all just coming to mind. And I don't have very specific examples because I don't follow powerlifting much anymore, but I know that powerlifters do this stuff, and I'm just wondering why. If you get prescribed a drill, or if you see someone doing a drill, and they can't tell you the exact mechanism for how that RP7 accessory drill, if they can't explain the mechanism for exactly how it's going to increase your strength, you probably shouldn't do it. Because I would say almost nobody needs to do specific drill accessory movements to complement their SBD other than just growing muscle. Now, if you're kind of confused about the whole drill thing and everything I've just spoken about, good. You should be confused about it. Hopefully you don't know what I'm talking about. If you know what I'm talking about, then I'm sure you'll have more examples come to mind because you probably follow powerlifting closer than I do. All I'm trying to say is when you're done your SBD, just go build some muscle. Don't spend your time mucking around with whatever drill you've seen on Instagram to improve your brace or increase your stability or, improve your hinge or whatever. You can get those qualities elsewhere during your SBD, during your warm-ups. It doesn't have to be a big fatiguing movement that ruins your hypertrophy for the rest of the session and takes ages. So skip the drills. Unless you're in pain, you probably don't need them. Now, in terms of other exercise selection, a lot of powerlifters will be very, very specific about the way they put on their belt, the way they put their chalk on, the way that they relax their upper back during bench press, all these specific things. And then they go to do their accessories, and it's like, oh, whatever. I'll just do this one. I'll just do this exercise. Next week, I'm going to do that one. It doesn't matter. It's only muscle growth. You can just change it up. It's easy. And then they wonder why they're not progressing and they're not growing muscle. So there are two main considerations for exercise selection. They better be consistent, and you better put some thought into it. Now, I'm not saying you have to think extremely hard about exercise selection, but you should think about it a little bit because it matters more than your little deadlift routine and the whatever squat warm-up you have that you think is so important. Your muscle growth is more important than those things. So when you're choosing your accessories, put some thought into it. Maybe instead of doing a dumbbell pullover, you do just a normal lat pull down. Maybe you think about it. Maybe you learn some anatomy. Maybe you follow a page like me and you go, well, if it matters for him and his clients, probably matters for me as well. Now, I'm doing everything I can to maximize hypertrophy, obviously. And as a powerlifter, you should be doing the same thing. Everything you can to maximize hypertrophy except taking away SBD. Obviously, taking away SBD would help, but you can't do that. So if it matters for me, it matters for you. So you want to keep your exercise selection as consistent as you can for as long as you can. There are only 3 reasons that you would take an exercise out: pain, enjoyment, and you've stopped progressing. Those are the only 3 reasons you should change a movement. I'll say them again. Pain that you cannot fix, enjoyment, and you cannot convince the client to keep doing it, or you've stopped progressing and you cannot figure out a way to progress it by changing reps, changing the angle, going to single arm, going to single leg, doing it in a different place in the workout, reducing the volume. You can't figure out how to progress it, then you can take it out. Those are your 3 reasons. And then, of course, actually putting some effort into choosing your accessories properly. A good example of this is redundancy within exercise selection. So doing 2 different types of lat pull downs in a row, doing 2 different tricep movements in a row, doing a hack squat and a leg press back to back. That is what we call redundancy. You are training the same muscle in the same movement pattern back to back, which makes the second exercise pointless. So if I do, let's say, a tricep movement here, like a single arm push down, and then I go and do a cross body extension, the cross body extension is basically useless because I've already trained the same muscles in my single arm push down. And I see powerlifters with redundancy all the time. So there are instances where you would do that, right? You would do the same muscle group twice in a row. I'm going to explain. So a good example, and the most common example you will see, is the quads. The quads grow more at longer lengths because of their length tension relationship, because they experience passive tension, which means they need a stretch. But the rec fem crosses the hip, which means you will not train the rec fem in a leg press, in a squat. It will not grow because as it lengthens at the knee, it shortens at the hip. So you'll train your 3 other quad muscles during squatting, during leg pressing, but your rec fem won't grow. So to grow the quads maximally, you probably want to do some sort of squatting movement and then a leg extension, because the leg extension, the sissy squat, and the reverse Nordic are the only ways that you will train your rec fem. And the sissy squat and reverse Nordic suck. So you want to use a leg extension. So a squat movement into a leg extension is not redundant because it's the same muscles in a different, well, it's actually not the same muscles because one of them has rec fem, one of them doesn't. But you know what I'm saying. It's 2 different types of movement for the same muscle, and it's necessary because rec fem is pretty important. So if you understand anatomy and biomechanics, you can really easily avoid redundancy. But if you don't understand them, that's fine. It's just probably a good rule that you don't need to do 2 different movements for the same muscle group in the same workout, except for maybe the quads because they need more volume as well. So as a general blanket statement rule, if you are a powerlifter using a 2 times frequency, which you should be, you probably never need to do the same muscle group in 2 movements in a row. So if exercise 3 and exercise 4 are both lat movements, you can just make one of them a lat movement and take the other one out. Things like that. So being conscious of your exercise selection, keeping them consistent is super important. So what have we covered so far? We covered high volume. We covered low frequency. So you want to do low volume. You want to do a higher frequency. No, I would never do a 3 times frequency for powerlifting. I would recommend that every single one of you use a 2 times frequency. Unless there is a muscle that you want to keep in maintenance, I would just train it once a week with 3 sets. That's our volume covered, our frequency covered. What did we touch on next? We touched on high reps. Useless. I don't care about what anecdote you've heard. High reps do not cause more growth. They cause less growth by fatigue. Then we touched on consistent exercise selection. And we touched on putting some thought into your accessories. We touched on not being redundant, so not doing 2 of the same movements in a row. And the last thing I want to cover before I get off and start work is movement quality. Now, there are so many things that I could talk about within the powerlifting community that need improving, but exercise execution, movement quality, you don't need to have a super slow eccentric, but it should probably be controlled. Now, a good rule is if you were going to attempt a new bench 1RM, you probably want to use control. Unless you sink it really hard and explode up, which most of you won't do. Think about the control that you would use on a bench 1RM attempt. You know, you add 5 kilos to your PR, you set up, and you go nice and controlled. You want to approach your accessories with the same intent. Maybe not as much intent as a new bench press, but something close to that. I see guys being very intentional with their SBD, and then they go into the leg extension or the chest press and they just pump it out. 1, 2, 3. And it's like, if you're going to be controlled when you're doing SBD, probably should be controlled when you're doing your hypertrophy work, your bodybuilding. Now, between 2 and 8 seconds, I've done studies, 2 and 8 seconds on the eccentric, it's all the same. So you probably can get away with a 2-second eccentric if you want to maximize growth. But What you really want to focus on is control, and specifically controlling the change of direction. So the top of a leg extension and the bottom of a leg extension. You want to make sure that the change in the direction is controlled for multiple reasons. The first one is so that you don't use too much momentum, because if you're using momentum, you're not actually contracting muscle fibers and you're not really doing the job. So you obviously don't want momentum, which a lot of people use on accessories, and they're still small and they wonder why. You're using too much momentum. But the second reason is that if we standardize our range of motion, we can track our progress more. So if I'm not controlling the eccentric or the changes of direction, I might use a different range of motion each rep, each set, each week. And that makes it really hard to track your progress because your reps aren't standardized. When you standardize your reps and you do the same thing every week, it's very easy to track your progress. This is the equivalent of getting on the scale each morning after eating food, different amounts of food, sometimes not eating food, using the bathroom, sometimes not eating the bathroom, and then wondering why your weight's so inconsistent. If you want consistency, which you do for progress, you need to have the same variables, which would mean that you get on the scale every morning after using the bathroom and before eating. And that makes a lot of sense. So in the gym, you want to do the same thing, where you use the same amount of control, the same range of motion, as similar of a tempo as you can every week. Obviously, we're not perfect, but you try to make it as consistent as possible so that when you write your sets and your reps down and you come back next week, you can reliably predict that you can add either a rep or a tiny bit of weight to what you did last week. And if you aren't aware, that is how we grow muscle. So progressive overload is a consequence of growing muscle, which means if you are progressively overloading, you are probably building muscle. In the exception of returning from holidays, returning from time off, after being sick, a new lifter, whatever. But if you're not those things, don't worry. So it's so important that you use control to actually make sure your muscle fibers are the things moving the weight, but also so you can standardize your reps, standardize your progress, and track your progress. Because if you don't track your progress, or you can't track your progress, how do you know if your program is working? You don't. Literally, the only way to know that your program is working is to track your progress. Now, you could argue that looking in the mirror can show you that you are progressing, and I would agree, it probably can, but that takes months. For me to look in the mirror and notice a difference, it could take 3 months to go, oh, maybe my shoulder looks a tiny bit bigger. And even then you don't know. So tracking your progress and your weights, your sets, your reps, and the intensity is the only way that you are going to know your program is working. If you have good progressive overload and it's consistent and it's reliable and it's predictable, your program is probably good. If you don't know because you don't track, or you do track, but what you're tracking isn't consistent, then you've got no idea. So I think I'll wrap it up there. That's 40 minutes. If you made it this far, thank you. I might sound a little frustrated or annoyed, and it's just because I think that there is a common disregard for science within the powerlifting community, because the powerlifting community operate off anecdotes. And a lot of people aren't open to being educated within powerlifting, really. There are a lot of people who never seek higher education, never try to find out why hypertrophy is important. And they just rely off anecdotes, and they take their own anecdote or someone else's anecdote as the Bible, as scripture. And they just operate under that forever, and their clients never see amazing results because it's just anecdote after anecdote. And if they just put a little bit of thought into it, they could be so much better at powerlifting. As I said at the start of the video, I guarantee every single one of you watching would benefit from putting more effort into your hypertrophy and doing a little bit less SBD. And I'd be willing to bet money on that statement. So if you made it this far, I really appreciate it. if you enjoyed this, I'll do more because it makes my steps easy. But that was a little rant. That's been on my mind for about 2 years. I've made a few posts about it, but I've never actually fully ranted about it. If you're from bodybuilding, I hope you enjoyed my powerlifting rant. If you're from powerlifting, I hope you learned something. Obviously, I'm not talking about anyone specifically. I am talking about certain communities within the powerlifting world who do things that I have discussed in this video. So, if you enjoyed, if you want to see me do more, leave a like or a comment, whatever, message me on Instagram. See you later.